Well, greetings. This is Dr. Dean Blevins again, and continuing with another lecture. In the past lecture, we talked primarily about the place of the children's pastor. This time, we'd like to discuss just briefly the place of children's ministry, talking a little bit about the traditional approaches that we see in many churches today, as well as some of the new horizons that are changing the face of children's ministry today. If you haven't read the opening chapter from the book Children's Matter, Celebrating Their Place in the Church, Family, and Community by Scotty May, Beth Bristersky, Catherine Stonehouse, and Linda Cannell, I would encourage you to do that. I'll be alluding to some of their content, though I'll be adding to it as the lecture goes on. And so it's helpful to have that in the background, or at least I would recommend that you immediately go and read that material as soon as you're finished with the lecture. Well, when we think about a sort of traditional approach to children's ministry, we probably think about particularly the place of Sunday school ministries in evangelicalism or children's church or other models of children's ministry that would be accepted as sort of the norm in defining what children's ministry looks like, including Wednesday night programming or VBS, Vacation Bible School, those types of ministries. And if there's any kind of a common image that maybe connects a number of those practices, it might be that of the object lesson. And I want to talk about the object lesson as a kind of icon, if you will, a governing image that portrays more than what goes on in that moment, but tells us a lot about how we have traditionally thought about children's ministry. Now, object lessons can appear just about anywhere, but probably the one place that they've become very prominent has been within the life of the traditional worship service, where often either a children's pastor or a pastor will do some kind of an object lesson for children and by extension for adults. Often either as a part of the worship or as a way of excusing the children into a children's church setting, or just a number of different reasons why the sermon in a sack or object lesson appears. The reason I think that's important is that because in some ways, not only do children see the object lesson as a primary way of expressing children's ministry, but so do adults, particularly adults in worshiping settings who see a pastor do this. Now, parenthetically, I think you know that many times pastors work very hard ahead of time in preparing the object lesson. There are some real horror stories of pastors who have allowed children just to bring objects in either to a children's church or a worship setting and kind of surprise the pastor. I tend to just recommend that that's not done. One reason, and these are more anecdotal stories, is that sometimes children appear with something that a pastor might not want to have to deal with. Two very famous stories that may be apocryphal, but have been recounted a number of times. One was in a children's camp where a female children's pastor was suddenly greeted with the present of one of her own bras as the object lesson of that day. Now, the other one probably is apocryphal, but it's still one that I do run across, particularly by pastors, where a young child showed up with a very small sack, but inside of it actually had a latex condom that they pulled out. Now, beyond those kind of horrific ideas, and I know that's kind of a gallows humor that probably shouldn't be included in a graduate level course, except for the fact that I have seen pastors really flabbergasted by what children bring sometimes. The other problem with the object lesson being hidden from the pastor until the moment of the presentation is that many times I have observed where ministers often will sort of take whatever the object lesson is and actually, instead of dealing with it in its own right, merely replicate, say, the same kind of story that they've used in the past. And after a while, not only children, but adults become somewhat disenchanted and disaffected by the kinds of object lessons that pastors do. Now, with that parenthetical caution, let me talk more about this idea of an object lesson. When you think about what object lessons are trying to accomplish, they really do reflect a lot of what children's ministry is about. First, they often are about abstract concepts. Often, uh, what the children's pastor or the pastor is trying to teach is some kind of concept that comes out of Bible or doctrine. Many times it's propositional and therefore seen as, quote, above the child's head. And so what they do is they feel like they need to relate that abstract concept, be it grace, salvation, some big idea, to a concrete experience. And so they will come up with some way of connecting it to everyday activity in children's lives and sort of by association say that this everyday activity represents, reflects that particular Bible perspective, biblical perspective, or doctrinal assertion. Again, primarily through a kind of very abstract understanding of Scripture and an abstract understanding of doctrine. And so the object lesson is really designed by association to connect abstract principles to daily children's activities. Well, let's back up for a second. One way to think about that is that those abstract concepts really reflect a very broad way of teaching that's often associated with a particular educational psychology called information processing. And that in many ways, a lot of traditional children's ministry puts a lot of effort into communicating concepts, ideas, sometimes very abstract, or Bible memory verses, and the whole idea is that we just get enough information into the children's lives that it will be meaningful for them before it's over with. The concrete experience side is often reflective of a different approach in children's ministry that's often associated with active learning, the idea that children need to be actively engaged in the material world around them. And that in many ways, that is the most important thing that they need to be thinking about. Now, to be frank, both of these approaches really have their own sort of disciplinary approach. When it comes to teaching concepts, the real emphasis is on cognition. And that's why for instance, a lot of curriculum is based on a kind of graded approach, sort of focused on the developmental readiness, the intellectual ability of the child to deal with certain concepts at a given point in time. Of course, we're deeply embedded to the work of Jean Piaget and psychology, and frankly, just the graded Sunday school curriculum that predates Piaget's work, that goes back to the 19th century, as a way of saying that children can process certain ideas at a certain point in their lives, and we need then to adjust the concepts based on their cognitive ability. A lot of the emphasis is on recognition and recall. This is one reason why a lot of curriculum includes benchmarks, so that by age 8 or 9, the child will be able to recite the Ten Commandments, or that they might be able to recite John 3:16, and then later, as a benchmark, we might even say that the child not only can recite the material, but then they can actually in some ways give meaning to that. As a matter of fact, most of the catechisms that we see in other denominations, as well as some of the material we're seeing now within evangelicalism, is still built on this kind of idea of recognizing and recalling. One of the reasons why children often are required to give the answers to questions in a catechism is a way of both recognizing the question and recalling the right answer. Now, at times also for motivation, when you put emphasis on the cognitive side, you really do want them engaged. And this is one reason why you'll see in a number of curriculum a lot of what I call mental puzzles. Many times they're putting games, or they're fill in the blanks, or they're Scrabble types of games, and that in a way what we want to say is that there's important cognitive material that children need to know, but the only way they're going to connect to it is by seeing it in a playful, entertaining fashion, albeit by getting their mind to be playful around these ideas, as well as merely memorize and regurgitate them as also. Now, if one aspect of children's ministry has really been built, if you think about it, around the idea of teaching concepts, and if you think about all the things that go on within children's ministry, how much time is spent doing the teaching of concepts, big ideas, I think we'd be surprised how much of our children's ministry is focused on that. but it's also about fostering activities. Again, going back to the concrete, often we're also interested in how children behave, how they act, how they respond, if you will, within the life of the church. And we create lots of activities that are there to try to shape behavior, hopefully in redemptive ways and meaningful ways. Part of that means that starting instead of with intriguing mental puzzles, that we actually try to make things entertaining so students move and are engaged and are active as a part of the learning process, so that from their own perspective, there is something fun and playful going on within the lives of students while they participate within children's ministry. Again, regardless of whether it's singing and dancing during children's worship or games during VBS, or even sometimes the kind of playful ways we open up Sunday school ministries. A lot of it's still saying, okay, concepts are important, but activities have to be there. Often we do recognize that we use activities to introduce and reinforce concepts. Again, much like the sermon in the sack, rarely does a pastor look out and say, so who here among you children knows something about the ontological relationship of the Trinity? No. We might, if we go to Fruit Hill, we might pull out an object that we think is going to try to reflect relationship or try to reflect the love of God. And we actually start with introducing concrete activity into the life of the child, at least something concrete that they can grasp, if you want to think about it that way, intellectually, or quite literally physically. Think about even sometimes how pastors will pass around objects with the children or hold them up high so even the adults could see exactly what the concreteness is. And that often when we think about, again, the sermon in the sack or other types of object lessons, we actually reinforce whatever we've taught by, again, displaying toward the end the same concrete symbol, or we'll ask kids to act in a particular way. Often those actions may be behaviors we hope we'll see them demonstrate at home, after church, but we actually look for a way of physically engaging children at the front and the back end of teaching a big idea in the middle of it. And that also means that we evaluate comprehension by application. One of the most important pieces I see again and again, particularly in curriculum, is this emphasis on application at the end of the lesson. I'm often amazed how many teachers do not actually come back and check on whether the idea from the previous week was applied in some way, in form and fashion, or if they'll give some kind of way of asking for application but then not follow through by conversing with parents so they know what's expected, as a way of trying to test the comprehension of what was taught for that day. And so again, I'm just really talking about traditional children's ministry that, if you think about it, we spend a lot of time either teaching concepts, focusing on cognition, or fostering activities, either tapping into pre-existing behavior or trying to change behavior as a way of demonstrating understanding. Also, when you think of traditional children's ministry, we tend to organize it primarily through age-level education based on both cognitive and motor abilities, and obviously available children. If you're in a small church, you've discovered that many times we put a lot of kids together into large groups just because we just don't have a significant critical mass of kids at a particular age level. But with all things considered, if we have a rather healthy, age-levelly diverse group of children, we tend to organize them around their intellectual abilities and their behavioral or just psychomotor abilities, what they can actually do. And so a lot of times nursery through preschool tends to define, I would call, what we used to call pre-elementary or early elementary education. And so we will have a kind of nursery, again based on children's cognitive abilities and just their psychomotor needs at that point in time, then a preschool. And then after that, we tend to organize pretty much, if you think about grade levels, from first to third and fourth to sixth grades. Now, I know that has changed over time. Part of that is because of the advent of preteens and the way in which children's ministry is understood in regards to them. Also, just in some sense, in the way schools have pressed preschool kids sometimes to reflect more first and second grade. So you don't have to be held up with these categories is this hard and fast, but all things considered, I think if you looked at most children's ministries, they will tend to assume at least 4 cohorts: the nursery, the preschool, kind of a pre-elementary, then grades 1 through 3, and then grades 4 through 6. And as a matter of fact, you'll actually find those similar classifications within the schooling paradigm completely. In addition, we often have children's church, which could be organized in multiple ways in Wednesday programming. And so even those, though, tend to be organized along age level concerns as well. In addition to the age level education organization, we do include certain program and event centered forms of ministry and activity. Most children's ministries have special activities, be it VBS or children's camps or some kind of children's ministry that they'll do on behalf of the children's area, maybe to senior adults or others, or sometimes when they exercise ministry through a children's choir, some ways in which they demonstrate ministry beyond themselves. And if we are pretty active and robust in our children's ministry, we'll also focus on providing some kind of support for parents as well as family training. We'll also provide support for adult activities, usually sometimes by providing nothing more than childcare, but actually many times I find children's ministries are asked to do a little bit more than just basically warehousing kids by providing some kind of smaller group ministry, either for a specific adult group. A good example would be MOPS, Mothers of Preschoolers, or a Mother's Day Out program, or sometimes even a divorce recovery program that has a lot of single moms. And finally, many times children's ministry is organized around certain aspects of pastoral care of children. This might mean visiting children in the hospital. It might mean sometimes visiting them in their schools. But in some ways, we're also expected to provide either ourselves or through other caring adults within our ministry some kind of oversight on the general care of children, so that if nothing else, we can kind of pay attention to both their psychological as well as their spiritual nurture on a day-to-day basis. Also, traditional children's ministry is anchored around certain special issues. A lot of children's ministers find themselves providing resources for teachers. In other words, that part of your responsibility is to resource other children's workers, either through a resource center or sometimes even making sure that closets or certain types of resource rooms are staffed and supplied where it's necessary. Many times children's pastors will be involved in curriculum selection and the evaluation of that, either by committee or just through your own efforts and work. Sometimes children's pastors will build what we call learning centers that enhance learning. It tends to diversify learning styles, and it can enable classroom management. And I've seen a lot of times where children's pastors who do not have a lot of resources or sometimes have to work with a very large range of ages in a given setting, like a children's church, will resort to learning centers as a way of sort of moving kids around within those different kinds of centers based on their abilities and give them a better chance of interacting that way. We're also responsible, obviously, for children's church or children's worship brochures. I'm not surprised when the kind of special issues many times is how you govern those. Other areas that you may be responsible for is guiding children's service projects, sort of leading them in ministry, particularly around big projects of compassionate care and other types of ministries that are outwardly focused beyond the life of the church. Some ministries really put a lot of emphasis on the evangelism of children, perhaps having special programs in the summer, like backyard Bible studies, backyard VBS, that are really gained to try to reach out to new children. And then finally, most of the time, children's pastors do have to bear some responsibility in the oversight and discipline of children, at least from within their own constraints and confines. In other words, how you help Sunday school teachers and other children's workers work with children. And if you have particularly unruly children, sometimes children with behavioral disorders, coming up with special care plans that try to keep them as a part of the church's activity may resemble something far more complex that say an elementary school or a local school might have to deal with, albeit you're doing it within a situation with a lot of volunteers and having to be very careful in how you're working with parents as well as in guiding those volunteers and working with children with those kinds of problems. All of these types of issues may have different emphases within different congregations. I know some churches that really do not spend a lot of time focusing on us resourcing teachers, but they do put a lot of emphasis on the children's church and even providing some kind of activity for children during worship. I've been in some churches that do not have any service projects, but do when it comes to empowering children to reach out to the community, but they are very active in evangelizing children in their community. So I hope you hear that each of these can be a part of any children's ministry, but they tend to be seen as sort of special based on the context, as opposed to what we discussed earlier, these bigger responsibilities of sort of teaching concepts and fostering activities, these kind of large responsibilities of thinking about age-level ministry as well as providing pastoral care, which seem to be endemic in almost any children's ministry to some degree and with some level of expectation. Now, in the reading that you're going to be doing, you're going to also come across types of images that seem to govern the way in which children's ministry works. I prefer, one way to think about this is through the language of head, heart, and hands. If you think about the fact that we are called to minister to children, either cognitively through the head, emotionally, affectively through the heart, or behaviorally through the hands, through activities, then that's one way to think about how all of children's ministry is organized. That in some ways we're always called to challenge children's thinking, not just cognitive learning, but literally the way they view the world around themselves. We're there to kind of shape their emotional well-being and their sort of love for others as well as their love for God. And then we're there to guide their hands, their behavior, the way they tend to act. Now, if you understand those orientations as being fairly true for any children's ministry, the different images that May and Postursky and Stonehouse and Cannell portray can also be seen as sort of focusing on specific areas. So a good example is Sunday school, for the most part, has been primarily focused on the head, the idea of teaching concepts. That's not true in every Sunday school, but a lot of Sunday school literature curriculum has really been built around the cognitive capacities of children and sort of guiding them in their learning process. And that has sometimes made Sunday school open to critique, particularly built around the next image, which tends to focus more on the activity and the actions of children through the kind of competition model that that's mentioned in the book, where children are really encouraged to, in some ways, modify their behavior in hopes of gaining reward as a result of that. And a lot of the behavioral reinforcement that we do sometimes in children's ministry it can have negative consequences, particularly in what has traditionally been called tokenism, that you'll run into in the reading, where children actually do certain activities not for the bigger purpose of understanding, but for the most immediate reward of the behavior. And we've seen examples of that in children's ministry on occasion. The carnival approach is really focused on children having a good time and whatever it takes for them to feel that they've been accepted and loved and feel as if they have enjoyed themselves as a part of the ministry. And again, the carnival approach is really built less on making sure children have certain key concepts, even doesn't necessarily focus on guiding behavior toward a particular direction, but it's really mainly there to help the heart really enjoy the experience and with the hopes then that children will return. Now, all three of these approaches tend to focus only in one area, and as a result of that, though they may include elements of the other. So a Sunday school class might have competitive components in it, and it may even have fun activities, or a children's church or a Wednesday night activity may be built around a lot of competitive games, but at the same time have some of those games being more intellectual, like Bible memory verses. There may be components in them, but ultimately the orientation, the belief is that these kinds of approaches, these images, if you will either in some ways shape the thinking, spark the behavior, or it will inflame the heart as a part of that. You'll also see two other approaches. One of them is the Pilgrim's approach. This one tends to be more of a discipleship, walking alongside children. The idea here is that children will sort of act their way into a kind of true acceptance of who God is and how God loves. And the last one that you're going to see is the one that's mentioned is called Dance with God, which actually in some ways is designed to inflame the joy in children in such a way that it also fires their imagination. And so here the head is less a place that collects information, but actually in some ways sparks the imagination as a part of how the child responds. But it does so through particular behavioral moves that are intended to guide the child. Now, you may not recognize all five of these images in the reading or in your everyday ministry, but it's helpful to keep these in mind. I did want to talk a little bit particularly about some of the newer models of children's ministry that really kind of fall in line with Children's Matter in the last couple of versions of what they talk about. Here, instead of the icon being the object lesson of cognition and activity, this approach really takes the idea of flipping, if you will, cognition to imagination and activity to formation. And so it is a particular way in which the mind is inspired and also a particular way in which the body is shaped. And in some ways it is still cognition, it's still learning, but it's always balanced with imagination, wonder, and exploration. If you've not explored the godly play movement, which is built on the work of Maria Montessori and Sofia Cavalletti, and has been popularized through Jerome Berryman's work and also Mary Stewart's work, you might want to take a look at that and wholeheartedly recommend it. I know this is one area that Scotty May is a major proponent of, as well as Catherine Stonehouse, because the idea here is it's still about the mind, it's still about the actions of children, but it's really a way in which both of those come together, not so much to command information nor to demand certain expectations after the learning occurs in everyday life, but to really shape children in a way that is more worshipful and yet at the same time see worship as a sacramental mystery, not merely just formation and training. The godly play movement, by the way, has had some interesting sort of impact on worship in the local congregation as well. And I'll just say that for now and let you begin to kind of contemplate that and think about that. We'll talk more about it as the semester goes along through reading and through some other forms of engagement. But this idea of how we in some ways lead children, if you will, through worship and forming and shaping them, and while also inspiring the mind through their imagination, has become a really new approach that takes the old object lesson and flips it, if you will, in such a way that it's not so much reflected of an elementary education approach, but much more out of a kind of sense of worship and pastoral imagination. In this kind of approach, you'll see that the activities are focused on creating a particular experience through formation. And so children will be learning a particular language, a particular story. And so worship and the Christian calendar begin to merge as well as education around the Christian calendar. It also tends, much like the pilgrimage model, to kind of focus on also the practicing of our faith. And so it really does focus on ministry and outreach, but as an extension of that worship-centered living, as well as that larger view of living out the faith in everyday life. I'm going to pause here for a moment and just mention one other issue. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I think it's an important one to consider, and that's the issue of child poverty. One thing we're going to discover and through our reading and through discussion is more and more the very plight of children has begun to shape the whole focus of children's ministry. Now, this can be portrayed in a number of different ways. One way to think about it is through orphan and orphan care, and you'll hear a lot about that in different settings. But it's also just really the care of all children, all God's children, particularly those who live on the margins of life, who live in disadvantaged situations not of their own making. And this is really important that I stress this. At times, even in evangelical churches, I'm surprised when we begin to talk about the relief of the poor, that people will often portray adults as participating in their own poverty. that they choose to be poor. Part of this is anchored in the Protestant work ethic, and sometimes it may or may not be true of a given circumstance. There's always anecdotal evidence both for and against it. But one thing I think we could honestly agree to is that the issue of child poverty comes not out of the children's decision to be poor. And so many churches, many congregations will respond powerfully to issues around the marginalization of children and families by extension because of the very plight of children. And this occurs both in the United States and globally. And so one of the things I think that I would encourage you to think about as you think about the future of children's ministry is, where is this as a part of your own role as an advocate for children alongside your sort of oversight of the cognitive and behavioral actions of children. I do believe that child poverty as a kind of icon in and of itself can also reflect the way we think about even the voice of children within the life of the congregation, their place in the church right alongside adults. I don't want to overstate that one, but in some ways, part of our role and this kind of shift in children's ministry is also asking ourselves, where is the place for the voice of children as children within the life of the congregation? Now that's a much more muted, nuanced approach than dealing with the material needs of children in our society today, but I think theologically they're connected. And so as you think about these sort of new models of children's ministry, particularly this idea of moving from the object lesson to the center of worship, which is the sacramental presence of God in that worship space as we are shaped and formed, but also our imaginations are fired together. And we think about the object lesson no longer merely about cognitive activities and simple behaviors, but a much more complex, rich way of thinking about children's ministry as the deeply spiritual, formative life of children through their sense of imagination and wonder of who God is and what God is accomplishing salvifically on their behalf. We're beginning to sense some of the way in which all of children's ministry may change over time. Now, I'll confess to you, the object lesson has not gone away. It is still a powerful icon, and it is resonant within a number of children's workers as well as children's pastors. The idea of either fun activities or the idea of simple memorization is still kind of core task, if you will, for certain pastors in children's ministry. But I want to encourage you as you can move forward and as you read the semester to also think about what happens when children are not merely an anecdote for the sermon in the sack moment, but that in some ways children and the way in which children worship and the way in which they awaken to the presence of God could really be an icon for the entire congregation. What difference that makes might be a very powerful ministry. Also, what difference it makes when we take the role of advocate, speaking on the places where children are still in the margins of society, either materially through their poverty, or sometimes, perhaps in a much more nuanced way, through their silence within the life of the congregation. I believe these are important images for the future of children's ministry, and I'll encourage you to think about them as we continue this semester. Now, blessings to you, and we'll be talking more about a theology of children's ministry in the near future.